Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. This is The Context.
Hugh Edwards has been named as the BBC presenter who has been suspended.
This is a man who has embodied BBC values, has been the face of the BBC, has held viewers' hands through so many of the kind of momentous, significant parts of our nation's history.
Detectives from the Met Specialist Crime Command have now concluded their assessment and have determined there is no information to indicate that a criminal offence has been committed.
Hello, welcome to the programme. It is a seismic evening here in the BBC newsroom. One of the biggest faces of BBC News, Hugh Edwards, has been named as the presenter, suspended over his alleged inappropriate contact with people much younger than him. We'll look tonight at those allegations. There are more, and from within the BBC. But the Met Police tonight has ended its investigation, which means the case, or cases, now revert to an internal inquiry. Why has it taken so long for these allegations to come out? Should the BBC be looking more closely into the dynamics between its well-paid presenters and junior staff? And we'll also talk later in the programme about NATO, the end of a two-day summit where all the talk was about a country that is not yet a member. This is BBC News. So, the presenter accused of a series of misconduct claims has been named as Hugh Edwards. His identity was revealed tonight by his wife. A statement from Vicky Flynn said this: "In light of the recent reporting regarding the BBC presenter, I am making this statement on behalf of my husband, Hugh Edwards, after what have been 5 extremely difficult days for our family. I'm doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children." Hugh is suffering from serious mental health issues, as is well documented. He has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days, she went on, have greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care, where he will stay for the foreseeable future. And once well enough to do so, she adds, he intends to respond to the stories that have been published. That statement came shortly after police confirmed that they have ended their inquiry into the Sun's allegations against him. The police said they'd found no evidence indicating a criminal offence had been committed. But there is reporting today within the BBC that he had made contact with 3 other employees here. 2 of them have since left the corporation. And there is an allegation from at least one that inappropriate and suggestive messages were sent. My colleague David Silito is with me. There was pressure mounting, David, for him to come out and make a statement, and now we understand why that statement wasn't forthcoming. We'll come to the allegations in a second. I don't want to put those second, but I just want to talk about him because it will come as a huge shock, I think, this, to his friends and his colleagues in the newsroom, and I think you and I would count him as one, and also to millions of people around the world who are so familiar with the face of Hugh Edwards.
I was looking back when he presented the BBC's election coverage in 2019. It was the first change of presenter on that job for 40 years. He occupies a unique role, and there's usually only one of them in the BBC, and these are the people who are the faces of the great moments, the elections, the state occasions, royal events. The number of people over the last 70 years who've held that position, really, in the BBC, you can probably count on one hand, and 2 of those names are Dimbleby's. And so for his name to be the one that's revealed, I mean, it was reported that 1 in 6 of the British population had guessed, knew the name. They'd gone on various bits of social media and thought, oh, it's him, or know enough. It still means 5 out of 6 didn't. And an utter shock, because the public face is the face. I mean, this is a man for whom, you know, it was all about respect, trust, and above all, dignity. that is what he brought to those moments. If you are presenting the 10 o'clock news, the flagship news of the BBC for 20 years, you are there because you are utterly reliable, utterly trustworthy, and somebody that the BBC hopes the audience trusts and respects. And, you know, you go back to the 90s. I mean, he was one of the presenters of the 6 o'clock news, since the 1990s. This is sort of 30 years he's been a part of people's daily life. So to hear all of this and the statement today, and really for anyone who knew him, and, we both knew him, you can only feel a sadness that this has happened. You can only feel enormous sadness for his wife and his children. How has it reached this stage? And whatever he's done for a person to be in hospital, being treated, he has a long history of depression. And his wife's saying he will be there for the foreseeable future. But of course, there are many questions to answer.
Well, sadness, absolutely so, because as I say, he remains a friend and a colleague, but also concern for those people who have come forward who didn't feel able to come forward for some reason until the last week. What have we learnt today about former employees within the BBC who have made allegations?
There have been one story after another. I mean, it began with a story about allegations of sexually explicit photos, a young person who was said to have been paid £35,000. Now, the statement from the police says that they have spoken to the young person and their family, and they say there is no information that they can see at the moment to suggest a criminal offence has taken place. But it doesn't mean that a line hasn't been crossed in terms of a relationship with a young person of some form or another. Then another story that came from The Sun talking about a meeting that may have happened during one of the COVID lockdowns, and also further revelations today about what seemed to be certainly inappropriate messages, the allegations that these are inappropriate messages to people, within the building, all of which has added beyond the initial allegation that there are questions to be answered. Now, the BBC had put its investigation on pause because there was the police looking into possible illegality, but there are many other questions now for it to look at. But it's got to be mindful it has a responsibility to its staff, so it has a responsibility to Hugh Edwards, who seems to be in a terrible situation at the moment, but also, of course, has a responsibility to all of the staff and people who may feel, I couldn't say anything, now I can. So what is the truth of it has to be rigorously gone through. This will probably not be a quick process.
No. Well, it's been on pause for several days because the Met Police were conducting their investigation and asked the internal inquiry to be put on hold. But one presumes now it restarts, and it now becomes what? An abuse of power inquiry? A man who was very well paid in a very well respected position, lording it over younger members of staff?
You have to look at the situation about employment. First of all, has he broken a contract? Has he broken guidelines? But also behaviour at work. I mean, if you've crossed the line, and this has been the ongoing story for the last 10 years, hasn't it? If you go back to the scandal of Jimmy Savile and everything that took back there, the central issue, and also with Philip Schofield more recently,
the deference
it's about
paid
power
to these high-paid
and relationships,
stars.
And it's whether or not people question and are able to question if you have lots of power. And in the media industry, the people who sit in these seats are the ones who are deemed often to have the power. So that is a question whether or not there has been this abuse of power in some way.
I just come back to this point because it's important for people watching. Is I never detected that, and a lot of people, I know I've spoken to you about it. It wasn't obvious. In fact, quite the reverse. He was
entirely the opposite.
He was the most gentlemanly, the kindest. He had information and help when I was coming up through the ranks. I've always found him very approachable.
He's a person who would speak up for you in a difficult situation in a newsroom. He would be there, often at your side, and you know that's why it's a shock to people within the building, because so many people liked him and respected him, and they can only feel this sadness. But the question, of course, is, was there something happening? I mean, that's what these allegations are all looking at, is whether or not, you know, a line was crossed. But they are all allegations. Nothing is proved at the moment. That is why there is an investigation. And at the moment, there is a man we know suffering a very serious mental health episode in hospital. And I think there needs to be some definite sympathy, especially for his family in a situation such as this.
David, for the moment, thank you very much for that. We'll have plenty more analysis in a minute, but let's just pause to look at how we got to this point. On Friday last week, The Sun published its first report carrying a mother's claims that an unnamed BBC presenter paid thousands to their 20-year-old child for explicit images over 3 years. They claimed it started when they were 17, a potential criminal offence. Further allegations are then published by The Sun newspaper on Saturday, and on Sunday, the BBC suspended that male member of staff, now known to be Hugh Edwards. On Monday, BBC executives met with the Metropolitan Police, which started their work to assess evidence, whilst the 20-year-old mentioned in the first Sun story that the claims that had been made, and this was a statement made through the lawyers, were absolute rubbish. Yesterday, The Sun published further allegations that the presenter broke lockdown rules to visit a younger man, and other allegations of direct messages with someone under 18. On the same day, BBC News published claims that the presenter sent menacing messages to a person in their early 20s. And then just before 6 o'clock this evening, as David told you, the Met Police confirmed they had assessed that there was no evidence of criminal activity after speaking to people involved in the initial investigations. The BBC had paused its inquiry. That has now resumed. At the same time, Hugh Edwards' wife, Vicky Flynn, issued her statement confirming he was the presenter involved. She said that Hugh was in hospital after that serious mental health episode. And as you heard from the statement, she added that her husband intended to respond to the stories that have been published once he is able to do so. Let's bring in Roger Bolton. He is a former BBC executive, now an independent producer. Roger, thank you for being with us. I want to focus now, if we can, on the victims. Police say they have not discovered anything that has risen to criminality, but there are plenty of allegations now that the BBC are looking at. What will be uppermost in their minds?
I'm not sure. And I have real reservations about your previous interview and what you've just been doing. I mean, this man is now, he's clearly got mental health issues. Before you put forward allegations, further allegations about him, you need to be testing them in some way. But we're in danger of having a litany of allegations to which he cannot respond. Wouldn't it be more sensible in these circumstances to let the BBC investigate these things and then publish their results, rather than outlining them at this point? I mean, do you know whether these allegations are correct? Have you evidence to support it? I think you've got to be very careful. The BBC.
Well, I think you make a very important point, Roger, because a lot of people have questioned whether a person who is of high profile, such as Hugh Edwards, is entitled to a private life. And of course, we talked very much over the course of the last few days, post the Cliff Richard trial, that a person in this position is entitled to a reasonable amount of privacy. Are you concerned that the prominence we're giving to it, the place it has within the headlines, is too much?
Yes, I do. I think it was very important that the BBC News demonstrated their independence and that they would report unflinchingly. And I think, frankly, you've done that. But I think over the last day or so, it's become almost self-obsessed, your coverage. I think the problem is that, there's so much else going on in the world. And you keep on reporting this, but at great length. But I think now we know, we ought to have known from the beginning that the family involved in the first particular complaint clearly have issues, and there are victims there. That's a family in difficulty there. We clearly know in this case that the presenter's family must be suffering terribly. We know the presenter's in hospital. We know the police have decided there's no evidence at the moment to go forward with criminal prosecution. We know that the BBC is conducting its internal investigation. Well, let it do that. Let it gather it. Let it test all these allegations, and then let it publish what there is. But meanwhile, why are we not saying to the Sun newspaper, you publish these allegations. You asked the BBC to actually give the detail you wouldn't give. What's the Sun's response? Has it got photographs? Has it got details of bank transfers and so on? It hasn't put them forward. And a lot of former tabloid editors are asking the same question. So I think it's about time, first of all, that you reduce the level of coverage that you've got on this issue. You test allegations much more than you are. And secondly, you focus and put the questions to the Sun newspaper about what they were doing in the first place. Another thing you might do, if I may say so, is ask all those MPs who very quickly, Nadine Dorries, Priti Patel, Lee Edwards and so on, who quickly said, let's name this person, and some who said they were going to name them in the House of Commons, to reflect upon the two tragedies we've got in this case. We should be very careful.
OK, well, let me read you this, Roger, let me read you this statement that's just come from the Sun. They say they have no plans to publish further allegations and they will now cooperate with the BBC's internal investigation process. So there will be, inevitably there will be, questions asked about the Sun and whether they publish prematurely.
Well, the Sun, well, you say prematurely, they may have not got the evidence. The Sun has refused to comment, as far as I can see before now. The editor has refused to be interviewed, as far as I can see now. There are big questions to ask about their behaviour and the behaviour of, I say, some MPs and others about this. I mean, this is a personal tragedy. It was blown into being a great scandal, the BBC's future at stake, whatever. It isn't that at all. And never, in my view, has been.
All that said, Roger, all that said, you're a former BBC executive. I just want to get an idea in my mind. Your brightest, best talent faces allegations, a variety of allegations from different people. Where do you start with the inquiry, and what are you trying to ascertain? People will want to know now, through that internal inquiry, what questions is the BBC trying to answer?
Well, I think that there are allegations all the time on the internet. The BBC said it was dealing, I think, with 250 at the time this one came up. We're about to move into a situation where we're going to have deep fake videos and AI. So this problem is going to come again and again. First of all, you have to find out, is there any evidence? And you have to test it. Then you have to give the presenter the opportunity, whoever it is, of answering that. And then you have to make the difficult decision, the balance between his right to privacy and whether or not it's in the interest of everyone that the person should be taken off air. What the BBC, until this is resolved, BBC took that decision about taking the person off air. I'm not sure that the BBC could have done anything else. You're balancing your responsibility to the public with your responsibility to the individual involved, and also you're concerned about the, things that have just happened today, where the mental health of people involved, you've got to be extremely careful. But you've got to have some real evidence, and you've got to test that before you can move into something which is career-threatening. And now, look, I agree with that general points made earlier about, we've had a lot of men in particular, very powerful men, who have behaved in ways which they have abused their power. That's undoubtedly true, and we must be aware of it. But we shouldn't automatically assume that every allegation is true.
Roger's right. Nothing is proven yet, David. But the allegations that have been made and have now been made public, and you can argue the toss if you want as to whether the BBC should be putting this in the public domain, but the allegations that are now in the public domain is that they felt uncomfortable, that the comments were about people's dress, and that it strayed, when they look back at it, it strayed over a line. What do you think the BBC will be looking at?
They'll be looking at potential abuse of power, if it has happened. They'll be looking at whether or not there's been a breach of guidelines, especially issues of safeguarding, And there'll be also the issue of someone in Hugh Edwards' position. There probably is an extra requirement of someone in his position to conduct themselves in a certain way. It might be a reprimand at the end of it, or it might be something more serious, or it might be nothing at all at the end. But it is about going through all of this litany of allegations. And the interesting thing about it, of course, is that, you know, the source of the allegations are, some of them are headlines in The Sun, some of it is, you know, work from BBC journalists who've published stories about it. And it's, you know, these have been made public rather than to the BBC. So the BBC itself now, you know, corporately has to carry out the investigation. And it's going to be fair to all sides.
But how do you answer Roger's point? And people, anecdotally, a lot of people have asked me this. Why it is a strange position when the BBC starts to run investigations and in a sense is trawling for allegations now. There are news programmes within the building who are looking for this. None of them are rising to criminality. They have yet to be tested, and yet we are putting them on a news bulletin.
Those are questions for, you know, the individual parts of BBC. It's interesting because you have to divide. I think for many people it's very, very confusing. I mean, the ultimate one is the times I find myself standing outside the building we're in at the moment, saying the BBC is not available for comment, and I think people are going, sorry, aren't you the BBC? And it's understanding that difference between BBC News, which is a very independent organisation within the BBC, and then there's the corporate BBC that carries out the investigations. You know, the Chinese walls that exist within the organisation are complicated even to those within it. But it is that interesting situation whereby people carry on without fear or favour investigating the story and publishing elements to it. But then it is the corporate side of the BBC that's got to go, hang on a sec, what's true? What boundaries have been crossed, and what do we decide at the end of the day?
Still waiting for the corporation's response, and I have asked for it tonight. The BBC press office not yet responding to the latest developments. Let's look at the legal aspects of the story then and bring in Steve Kuncevich. He's a media partner in the law firm Gleises based in Manchester. Thank you very much for being with us. We've talked in recent days about the reasonable right someone has to privacy who is under investigation. It is the family that has now put the name in the public domain. I can well expect that it will now be open season. What do people have to consider?
I think people have to consider very carefully what comes next. I'm sure the press will. The Sun have seemed to indicate that they're going to go at least slightly quiet, even though there's going to be pressure on them to justify their reporting, justify their sources, and justify the way in which they've approached this particular story. But we're now going to have the debate will rage on, hopefully while Hugh Edwards gets himself some much-needed help, hopefully while everybody involved gets themselves some much-needed support. The BBC's investigation should then continue, and now I would imagine there is legal advice being taken about what to do next, about how the story has been reported, about the fact that allegations have spread extremely widely over social media, and also the fact that the Met have indicated that there isn't any criminal activity here. So questions of public interest are going to be tested over the course of the next few days and weeks, but it is certainly going to be still some time yet before we know all the details of this story.
Yeah, as Tim Davey, the Director General, said just the other day, it's a very difficult balance. Privacy, duty of care, investigating the allegations and answering a legitimate public interest in the story. Why do you think, given the statement tonight and specifically the detail we've had on Hugh's health, why do you think the Sun newspaper has now decided not to publish any further allegations?
I would strongly suspect because it's as a result of privacy law. There's been an awful lot of discussion over the course of the last few days about the fact that there is this stated reasonable expectation of privacy now when an investigation is underway. That started out with the Cliff Richard case, the Bloomberg case fairly recently as well. And they're going to be thinking very carefully about the fact that this is clearly doing some harm and has done potentially some irreparable harm to an awful lot of people, not least of whom is Hugh Edwards. That will affect any potential claim you might have going forward. Obviously, obviously a legal claim might be the last thing on his mind right now. He's going to be wanting to get himself well. Everybody involved is going to be wanting to get themselves some support. But it has been reported very, very carefully for a number of different reasons. He's not been named, and a lot of evidence hasn't been shared. We're going to find out why that might or might not be over the course of the days and weeks to come. But we are going to see a great deal more speculation. These allegations are unfortunately going to carry across social media, and we certainly haven't heard the last of this issue.
Steve, thank you very much for that. David, final word, just got 50 seconds. We should point out that Hugh Edwards has not resigned, and he remains an employee, and he is innocent at the moment.
Absolutely, and there is a process looking at it. But I think the one thing you take away from it is the thing I think I felt when I first heard about this, is that, you know, the person I know is a man of charm, decency and kindness. I was utterly bamboozled, shocked when I heard this, and I think many, many other people will be today when they hear this name. And he's obviously in a very difficult situation at the moment, but there is a process.
David Sillito, thank you very much. Plenty more to come. You're watching BBC News.
Hello there. It's certainly a very different weather pattern this month in Europe compared with what we had last month. This time around, it's lower pressure that continues to bring cooler, unsettled weather across the north and northwest, whereas in the south, we've got higher pressure, dry weather, and it remains very hot through the rest of the week and beyond. We do have some storms, though. These could be quite nasty, actually, as they run their way